Hello, welcome to Alyssa Jean's Reviews. My name is Alyssa, and today I would like you to join me on a walk. We're going to take a walk together down Nostalgia Lane. Alright, so welcome to Nostalgia Lane. This is a new monthly series I will be doing in which I will go back and rewatch a film that I first saw as either a child or a teenager, probably somewhere before the age of 20. And in most of these cases, I probably will have seen it many, many times when I was younger, but in most cases, I will not have seen it in a very long time. And this month, I am starting with Back to the Future. Alright, so I'm going to start with my introduction onto why I chose Back to the Future for this series. And actually, since this is the first video in this series, I'm also going to kind of combine that with why I chose to do this series at all, and it's kind of linked together with why I chose Back to the Future. So this series, Nostalgia Lane, is inspired by a docu-series on Netflix called The Movies That Made Us. Currently, as I'm recording this, there are 8 total episodes of it on Netflix, and I just read that a few more are coming out in a couple weeks here. I was watching the episode that's on Back to the Future, and I just decided I really, really wanted to rewatch Back to the Future and review it. So once I did that, I was like, well, why don't I just do a whole series? Well, I just go every month and rewatch a movie I haven't seen in a very long time and review it. And thus Nostalgia Lane was born out of my need to watch Back to the Future. Now, Back to the Future is actually going to be the exception in this series because I actually did just rewatch the entire trilogy 5 years ago. So not that long ago, whereas all the other movies that I am going to choose are going to be movies that I have not seen in probably 20 years or more. And I will do another one in the end of October. So technically this video is dropping on October 1st, but I'm kind of counting it as the September version. So I will do one at the end of October as well. And at the end of this video, I will tell you what that next film is going to be. All right, so now I think let's go ahead and get into part 2, where I talk about what I thought of the film from a child's perspective. Okay, so Back to the Future was released in 1985, obviously, and I was 11 years old at that time. And so for me, as an 11-year-old, my interest in this film was completely because of the time travel aspect. I was already a big sci-fi nerd, and in particular, I loved time travel stories. At that point in my life, I think mostly what I would have seen would have been probably from the cartoons that I used to watch. I'm pretty sure the Super Friends had traveled back in time once or twice. Also from Star Trek. I had already seen at that point the classic episode Sitting on the Edge of Forever, and just been blown away by the Guardian of Forever. And I think I probably had even read H.G. Wells' Time Machine at this point already. I know I read it when I was fairly young, so I was just super into time travel. Going into it, I don't know if I really knew exactly what it was, that it was going to be a comedy. I mean, I did know that, as I called him at the time, Alex P. Keaton, the guy from Family Ties, was going to be in it. So I I think, had a sense that it was probably going to be a little lighthearted just because he, stars in a sitcom. I had that sense, but I don't know that I really fully knew that I was getting into kind of a somewhat of a comedy. I just really wanted to see a movie about time travel. And so that was where my interest was. And then once I saw it, I was blown away. It was I think at that time it automatically became my favorite time travel story that I had ever seen. I don't remember the exact details of what drew me to it about this particular time travel story. But I do think that I really liked the DeLorean as a time travel machine. I liked the tension in the beginning when Marty is forced to jump into the DeLorean and go back in time. I think I felt into it. I felt the tension all the way through, and I was just really invested. Really invested in Marty McFly getting his parents back together. And of course, also as an 11-year-old, there's a lot of humor in the film. I still appreciate it today, but it's good for an 11-year-old too. Like all of Biff's lines, "Hello, McFly, hello," and how he got all of the cliches wrong. I think in the first film, I think he only did one, but he continues to do more in the other films. But in the first film, he goes, "Make like a tree and get out of here." And I thought that was hilarious. And my brothers and I would then quote that all the time. Actually, there were a lot of things that my brothers and I would go on to quote all the time from this film. And we'd even sing hum the music from like the Enchanted Sea dance. Like that would get stuck in my head for hours on end, and I would just go around humming it. So it just instantly, we just latched on to it, myself and my siblings, and just really got into it. And I probably saw it at least one additional time in the theater. And then what we used to do back in the day is once a film came on HBO or Showtime or whatever, we would tape it, and then just watch it over and 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 over. So I watched Back to the Future hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and then once 2 and 3 came out, then eventually we did the same thing with them. We recorded those and watched them over and over and over again. But I think I probably watched the first one the most. And going into it, as I mentioned, as far as I know, it was Alex P. Keaton. It was that guy from Family Ties. And then Christopher Lloyd, he was the Klingon from Star Trek 3. And my mom told me, oh yeah, he's the guy in Taxi too. And I had kind of seen Taxi here and there. Like it wasn't one of the sitcoms that I had really watched a lot at that age. I ended up watching Taxi later, but at that age I was still in Different Strokes and Facts of Life phase. So I wasn't super familiar with Christopher Lloyd. But after the film, I saw a film with Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd, not the dude from Family Ties and the dude from Taxi or the Klingon from Star Trek 3. It was Michael J. Fox and it was Christopher Lloyd. So not only did that movie put them on the map for the world, but it put them on the map for me personally. From there on out, I was a huge Michael J. Fox fan. Michael J. Fox's just kind of cool and charming demeanor, and just the way that he talks, like, Doc, I can't do a Michael J. Fox impersonation. Please don't make me do that. But you know what I'm talking about. It just meshes so well with Christopher Lloyd. They were so good together, and they just had such great comedic moments. Even when I remember when I first saw it, when Christopher Lloyd goes when he takes a little toy car and puts it over his little map and the lights on fire, and he goes and just his facial expressions are just so good. Like it's just, I think it's kind of cartoonish, which is probably why I loved it as an 11-year-old, but it works so good for this film. So, for part three, I want to start by talking about things that I noticed on this most recent rewatch that I have never noticed before. Even 5 years ago when I watched it, I didn't notice these things. Just two things that really stand out. One, in the beginning, that when they're panning over all of the clocks in Dr. Brown's laboratory, and there's just clock after clock after clock, and there's all these different clocks. There's cat clocks, there's bird clocks, there's clocks, and they're going through that. There's an Easter egg in there that I never noticed until now because I think I was never really paying that close attention to that scene. But one of the clocks actually has the silhouette, it's like a black silhouette of a man hanging from the hands of the clock. So it is precisely foreshadowing the ending of the film when Doc Brown is hanging from the clock. And I was like, oh my God, they're foreshadowing the ending right there. I never noticed that before. It's just one of like hundreds of clocks that they show you in the beginning, so it's very easy to miss. So I thought that was kind of cool little Easter egg that I have not ever noticed. And God, we're getting close to 40 years now. Oh my God. And then the other thing that somehow, I don't know how I never caught on to this before, is that toward the end, well, not the end, but, in the latter part of the film, when Biff's goons go to put Marty McFly in the trunk of a car, it's the trunk of the car of the band, and the band comes out and they are smoking a lot of weed, and all the weed smoke comes pouring out, and one of Biff's goons say, hey, we don't want to mess with reefer addicts. And I understand why I didn't notice that when I was a kid. Marijuana, weed was not on my radar at age 11. I wouldn't learn about that until a few years later. But how I didn't catch it 5 years ago, maybe I just wasn't paying attention to that part, or maybe I did notice it and I just forgot that I noticed it. But when I watched it last night, I was like, they're smoking weed! And he's called them reefer addicts. How did I never notice this before? So weird. Anyways, so those are kind of the things that stood out. Now I kind of want to talk about some critiques that I have from rewatching the film. Now, I want to be upfront and make it clear that this film has me swimming in nostalgia, and pretty much it can do no wrong for me at this point. The nostalgia is pretty latched on to me, so when I give these critiques, they're just things that I notice that I find interesting. Do they make me like or appreciate the film any less than I ever have? Not in the slightest. I still love this film as one of the all-time greats. But I would say that it's not a perfect film. I keep reading all these reviews in my research or articles that refer to it as the perfect film. And I think they even might have mentioned that. Somebody might have said that in the Movies That Made Us docuseries. It's the perfect film. Well, it's not the perfect film. It does have flaws. It is still one of my favorite films of all time. But to say that it doesn't have flaws would not be honest. It does have flaws. So I just want to point out some things that I noticed. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm complaining. This does not take away from my appreciation of the film. It's just things I notice. So, the dialogue is very corny. The way that people talk is not at all how people talk in real life. But I think I'm noticing that now because I don't watch anything else that has that kind of dialogue in it. Whereas back then it probably would have just seemed normal because it's pretty typical kind of dialogue that you would see in other comedy films, other John Hughes movies, especially in like teenage-centric movies, and definitely sitcoms. Like it's the kind of dialogue that you would get in sitcoms too. That people in real life don't talk that way. But it was normal. It was normal for a film of this type back then, but watching it now, it stands out. So, like, just one example I wrote down, the vice principal or whatever, Strickland, not only calls McFly a slacker, but he says, "No McFly will ever amount to anything." Do principals really say that to people? I mean, I know there's probably some principals who are, not the best with the kids, but I mean, who says no McFly will ever amount to anything and says, "Your dad was a slacker too"? It was kind of just very contrived to, set up for what was happening coming later in the movie. Your dad was a slacker just like you. And then when he approaches George McFly, when we see him, "You're a slacker," like right after he was getting kicked by a bunch of Biff's goons because they put a "kick me" sign on him. I don't know. That's not how people react or talk to each other. And then Lorraine in the 1950s, her dialogue was just so ridiculous. I think that it was pretty common to portray teenage girls, especially in period pieces, like in the 1950s, like watching something in the 70s or 80s, like Happy Days, that took place in the 1950s. I think this was probably typical type of dialogue, and I wasn't around in the 50s, but I just have a feeling that girls didn't go around talking like this because it's just so hokey and ridiculous. Like when she sees Marty riding around on his skateboard and ends up, with Biff and all of them getting poop on their car, she goes, "He's such a dream." Like, what? And that's just like one example. Like pretty much every word out of her mouth was just so ridiculous and like over the top, like teenage girl and not behavior that I think any teenage girl in the 50s really ever had. And her behavior in general was just very like, I don't know, like it's like over the top hyperbolic teenage girl behavior, and she just kind of went with the wind on which boy she liked, and it was just like, and I know there's some truth to that with teenagers, but not to that extreme. Where she likes Marty, she likes George, she likes Marty, she likes George, and falls deeply in love with each of them. I mean, I guess I'm leaving the realm of dialogue now, talking about this, but it looks sort of silly, but again, very, very common for the era. Now, I also want to talk about something else, a little heavier topic. This was also very common for the era, so it's hard for me with all my nostalgia to really hold this against Back to the Future. However, I do think it's a topic worth exploring and talking about a little bit, and that is how sexual assault and rape is handled in this film. And I think it pretty much handled that way. And most comedy type films or shows from the era, and probably even some today, I don't know. But it's just a very nonchalant way of approaching sexual assault. So there's the scene in the cafeteria where Marty is trying to get George to ask Lorraine out, and Biff is over basically trying to sexually assault Lorraine, like right there in the middle of the cafeteria. I mean, I don't know what else you would call that. And no teachers are doing anything about it. No principals are doing anything about it. No students except for Marty McFly. And that's why Lorraine is like, "Oh, Marty actually stood up for me when I was about to get raped." I mean, it's kind of shocking, actually. Because it's just, he's trying to grope her and kiss her against her will. Right in front of everybody, and it's just this very nonchalant attitude, and it's not like sexual assault is presented as a positive thing or anything, but it's presented as, oh well, it's just this thing, that happens. No, what are you gonna do? Boys will be boys, that whole thing. And then Marty comes up with this really odd plan to pretend to sexually assault her so that George can come rescue her. First of all, His plan was basically not really to sexually assault her, but was basically just to try to kiss her and assume that she was going to reject him, which was a bad plan because she wouldn't have rejected him. It would have been mutual, and then he would end up making out with his mom, which very nearly did happen. Because she was, as you see, very much into it, so it wasn't a good plan. Anyways, but putting that aside, let's say that his plan had worked. That she didn't want anything to do with him, and so that he would have this opportunity to kind of force himself on her. Isn't that kind of fucked up? Like, he's gonna pretend, like, he's gonna basically try to, sexually assault his own mom? What? And then, it's a weird plan. And then, Biff comes in, and actually he's raping her. I don't know how else to describe it. They portray it in a very cartoonish kind of way, where, you just kind of see her dress moving around going, it's like he's tickling her or something. But he's basically raping her. And it's just the attitude of the film is just like, it's just this thing that happens. What? It's kind of shocking. Thankfully, I do feel like, post Me Too movement, and there's just more out there in the general public to kind of educate people about that I won't say that you wouldn't see that in a film or show today, but if you do, it really stands out a lot more. I think it'd get a lot more criticism. I think it'd turn a lot of people off. Whereas in the 80s, it was normal. It was par for the course. So it's hard for me, especially with all the nostalgia, for me to fault the film for doing that. But it is interesting to point out and talk about it. Okay, and now, since this is a time travel film, I have to talk about the time travel logic because I'm such a nerd. And that is that there is no time travel logic. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And you know what? It was written by Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis, two comedy writers. They weren't sci-fi writers. They didn't give 1 millisecond of thought to the time travel logic, and it shows. And that's fine. It worked for the film. And at the time, I think it was pretty commonplace for time travel movies to just have bad time travel logic. I think most films of the time, and even today, I think use what I would call the type 2 time travel logic. So type 1 time travel logic is the whatever happened, you can't change the past. So if you go back and do something in the past, then it always happened. Type 2 is what I call the Back to the Future time travel logic, personally, because it's what you see here. When you go back and change the past, you've disrupted the future, and you have to kind of correct it. And then type 3 is the MCU and Star Trek 2009 time travel logic, where you create a different timeline and the other timeline still exists. So it's interesting, in Back to the Future 2, they do talk about creating another timeline, but that's the only timeline now. He can't go back to the original timeline anymore, so it's still the type 2 time travel logic. But the reason why I would say that this type 2 time travel logic is my least favorite is that it's impossible to do without paradoxes. So the big time paradox here is that if Marty never existed, then how would he have been able to stop his parents from meeting and make himself not exist anymore? That's a paradox. Paradox that is not a problem with type 1 or type 3 time travel logic. And actually, I've read, I used to read all of these, like, books from Stephen Hawking and Mikio Kaku. I think I just said his name wrong. Mikio Kaku. The Asian guy with the long gray hair. But one of the books that I read at one point said that scientists theorized that if there was time travel, it would definitely be type 1. It would be, you can't change things. Now, who knows how true that could possibly be, since it's all theoretical. But that made a lot of sense to me because it's not. It's a lot neater and cleaner. Time travel logic. It's harder to have paradoxes. Whereas with this Back to the Future time travel logic, it's impossible to have paradoxes. Also, there's the Chuck Berry paradox. So, if Chuck Berry first heard of Johnny Be Good because Marty McFly was playing it, then what did he do in the original timeline when Marty McFly wasn't playing it? So I guess he would have just come up with it by himself. Anyways, the real answer is, as I said, the writers didn't put 1 second of thought into time travel logic. They just thought it would be a really funny gag. That would be Chuck Berry. That's Chuck Berry's cousin, and that's how he learns how to write Johnny Be Good. They just thought it would be a funny thing to throw in the movie, but it actually doesn't make sense from a time travel logic perspective. And one thing that I thought of for the first time in watching this rewatch is that, so when Marty comes back 10 minutes early, which, by the way, why didn't he give himself more time than that? Case the car broke down or whatever. But anyways, he goes back and he watches himself. Wouldn't that be the Marty from the new timeline who has the truck and his parents are, cool now or whatever? I don't know. Because he is in that timeline now. So would that Marty still... Yeah, I know it sounds like I'm overthinking it, but that's why I'm saying, this does not affect my enjoyment of the film at all. But I am a geek about time travel, and I still love to pick apart the time travel logic. So please indulge me in my overthinking it, because this is a lot of fun for me. So the last thing I kind of wanted to touch on is... whether or not the film still holds, even though the present day of the film is now 6 years ago now, and they're traveling back into 30 years before that. And to me, it does. It does still hold. I watch that film and I get just invested in it, and in my mind, 1985 is the present, and it makes total sense to me. And I think that probably has a lot to do with the fact that I saw it so many times close to 1985, within the first 5 or 6 years of its release. As I said, we had it on VCR tape. We watched it hundreds of times. So I can easily slide into that mindset. I feel like maybe somebody watching it now for the first time, if you're a younger person watching it for the first time, it might be a little weird. But for me, I can slide right back into it, and it still works for me. That said, I will say that Back to the Future is a rare film in which I would be totally on board with a reboot. I'm usually anti-reboot. Anytime a reboot comes out, I'm like, really? Do we need to reboot everything? Really? Come on. But Back to the Future could use an update. It would be interesting to see a version of Back to the Future where somebody starts in, let's say, 2025 and then goes back to 1995 or maybe even 1985, which would be really ironic. I think that I would be on board with that, especially since the rumor, and this is actually, I just looked this up again, and this rumor was circulating February 2020, so it's been a while. I don't know whatever happened to this, but the rumor was Tom Holland was going to be in it. I cannot not imagine a better choice. He's got this very Michael J. Fox energy to him, and yet does his own thing. But I love Tom Holland. To me, he is the best Peter Parker of all the live-action Peter Parkers. Tobey Maguire is the most comic accurate Peter Parker, but Tom Holland is the best one. He just has that charm. And he's got these very Michael J. Fox-esque qualities, so I am here for that. I don't know if that's still a thing. As I said, the most recent article I found on this rumor was from February 2020. So I don't know, but I would be on board with it. And it's a rare reboot that I would be on board with, because as I said, I'm usually very much against them. But it would be interesting to see it kind of go the other way and start in the 2020s and then go back to the 80s or 90s. Anyways, I think I have talked enough on Back to the Future. So let's go ahead and start wrapping things up. Okay, so let's do the wrap up, and I'll give my rating out of 10, with 1 being the lowest possible score and 10 being the highest possible score. Almost all of the movies that I will review in my Nostalgia Lane series would have been a 10 back in the day. So the question is, are they still a 10? So in the case of Back to the Future, my rating right now, after my rewatch, is still a 10. Always will be a 10. There's just a very special place in my heart for Back to the Future. Don't worry about all of those critiques that I had and the time travel logic. I don't care. It's always a 10. An absolute 10. And this is not going to be the case for every film I do in Nostalgia Lane. There are some that I have planned, and I'll tell you about one of them in just a minute, that I think there's a very strong likelihood they're going to knock down to 9.8 or a 7, possibly even. But Back to the Future, I always knew it was going to be a 10. It's a very special movie to me. Okay, so let me quickly just tell you what's coming at the end of October. So, I am not going to let the calendar tell me how to pick my films. So just so you know, it's not going to be a horror movie. It's not going to be a freaking Halloween themed movie. Then I'm stuck and then I have to do a Thanksgiving movie in November and I have to do a Christmas movie. No. The calendar doesn't tell me what to do. I'm picking movies that I want to watch. It's going to have nothing to do with the holidays. So this is going to come out, I think, on the 29th of October, a couple days before Halloween. But fuck Halloween. This is not what this is about. It's a movie that I really wanted to watch. It's a movie that I've been thinking about lately. I've noticed it's on Netflix and I haven't seen it in a very long time. And I'm very, very curious if I will like it as much as I used to. And that is Total Recall, the 1990 sci-fi thriller starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Used to be one of my favorite movies of all time, but I haven't seen it in a while. So I'm really curious what I'm going to think of it now. So that will be at the end of October. And then in November, I'll be back with another Nostalgia Lane video. And in December as well. And they're not going to be holiday themed. God damn it. Anyways, thank you so much for joining me and sticking with me for this review. I will see you next month on Nostalgia Lane. And please subscribe and check out all the other things this channel has to offer for you. And I will see you soon. Goodbye.